Fake news. That's what Peter thought when Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Mary, the mother of James, told him that Jesus was no longer in the tomb but living. Angels dressed in dazzling clothes rode minding the women that Jesus said he would die and rise again? Surely this must be an idle tale. There was no Scopes back in Peter's day to fact-check the news, so he went to the tomb and looked things over himself. Fake news. That's what the two men on the road to Emmaus thought when they heard that Jesus, son of Joseph, was no longer in the tomb. You know, you can't trust those news pundits, they said to the stranger on the road. We saw him crucified 3 days ago, and there's no way he's walking around today as if nothing happened. The man on the road then broke bread with them and blessed it, and suddenly that very fake news didn't seem so fake. The travelers knew that outlandish tale that they heard was true. Now, for those of us listening to the familiar story of Jesus' resurrection 2 centuries later, there may be many of us, or at least a couple, who are wondering how those disciples ever could have doubted that Jesus would rise from the tomb. Jesus himself, as the angels reminded, repeatedly said that the Son of Man would die on a cross, be entombed for 3 days, and rise again. And especially for these disciples who had seen all of the miraculous things Jesus had done, the healings, the miracles, welcoming the stranger with ease, standing up to authority, forgiving criminals from the cross, how could they doubt? How could a disciple doubt? Where is their faith? It is easy for us to critique the disciples who doubted the empty tomb, but we are a lot more like these doubt-filled disciples than we perhaps like to admit. Most of us are pretty much on board with, okay, resurrection will happen for us one day when we die. But there are many among us here this morning, sometimes myself included, that doubt that resurrection is real in this life. When we are in the midst of trials and tribulations, we wonder how or if God will liberate us from the tomb that holds us hostage. In times of grief, in times of health challenges, when our marriages are falling apart and our bank accounts sit empty, we hear the good news that God can save us from all things, even that thing that we just mentioned, and we say, really? That sounds too good to be true. Must be fake. If news sounds too good to be true, it probably is, right? We are gathered here this morning as believers, as disciples, not only to rejoice that Jesus was resurrected from the grave over 2,000 years ago, we are gathered here today as a living testimony that we believe resurrection can come to us today as living disciples. When this world and the forces within it tell us that our situation is nothing but doom and gloom, that there is no possible way that we can experience joy or love, we profess that Jesus will find a way, and Jesus will. We profess that God has the power and might to liberate us from any tomb that holds us hostage, not just the tomb of the grave, and even, especially, when that liberation feels too good to believe. This last week, I watched the news, as many did, as the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris burned. It was as if I was watching a movie directed by J.J. Abrams instead of watching something that was really happening. Surely this fire was fake news, that such a historical institution that inspired so much art and music and literature and Disney movies could be turned to ash and dust. Well, this could not possibly be real. I had to see it with my own eyes. And then the news reports came in that this fire started because of a construction accident of all things. And once again, I found myself in a state of disbelief, especially in light of the domestic terror that happened to the church in Louisiana this week, with all of these acts of terror that are happening around the world, the idea that this particular historic monument was caused because of an error, that must be fake news. There's no way one simple mistake could lead to such a tragic loss. I watched as the flames rose. I watched as courageous firefighters fought that fire. I watched as Christians gathered around the cathedral that night, their faces lit with the flames of the fire as they sang hymns and read scripture and offered prayer. And as I was watching those grieving people, I could not help but wonder if their faces looked a little bit like the faces of those who watched Jesus die on the cross. So hard to find connection and hope in the midst of such a terrible loss. The fire went out. Paris became as dark as a tomb, and the earth sat in the silence of ash and debris from that fire. And then the next morning came. The sun rose, and with it rose a story that seemed too good to be true. Now, I'm an art lover, I'm a music lover, and so I know that the cathedral is most known for its iconic organ and its stained glass rose window. And everyone knew for certain that those things would be destroyed by the flames. They were near the heart of the fire, and yet, somehow, they survived. This news seemed impossible, outlandish even. A fire that can stretch hundreds of feet into the air is extremely hot. A fire that can destroy several stories of one building is extremely hot. Everyone knew with a certainty that that metal from the organ would melt, that that glass would melt and panes would fall out. We were certain of it that Monday night. And yet Tuesday came, and they were saved. It makes no sense that they did not melt in the extreme heat of the fire. It is illogical. It is surreal. Firefighters today still cannot explain how they survived. Their survival should have been impossible. And yet, here we are. When that cathedral rebuilds, that part of its history will continue to be there, being a part of the new thing that God does in that place next. This, friends, is what resurrection looks like in this life. You don't have to wait to die for things to get better. God is already working on that through Jesus. We are gathered here this morning not just to celebrate that Jesus rose from the tomb some 2,000 years ago. We are gathered here to profess that the risen Christ will find ways to rebuild our life from the greatest fires and the darkest of tombs. We are here to profess that resurrection is not some historical event or something we have to wait for until we're dead, but that God is coming to us every single day to make our life new. Resurrection comes to us anytime we have a chance to move forward when it seems impossible. Resurrection comes to us when we can hardly catch our next breath and yet still make it to the morning. Resurrection comes to us when we're in the midst of a fight with our spouse and we think there's no way for us to move on and our spouse says, I love you. Resurrection comes when our children are screaming at us and they're crying and they're throwing tantrums and we think, how am I supposed to do this? And you find out they did great on their school reports. Resurrection is the opportunity to live today unhindered by the mistakes of yesterday. Resurrection is starting fresh when all hope seems lost. And this is what God gives you today. God gives you life today. Jesus lives today. Jesus is bringing new life to you today. At times, it seems impossible. It may even seem like fake news, and there are certainly voices out there that will tell you not to believe the good news of this Jesus. But this, friends, is the mystery of the resurrection. Because Jesus walked out of that tomb. The promise God makes to you today and every day is that nothing is impossible. A fresh start is always before you. Amen.